always better to get it out of the way before someone speaks as well. That's definitely a lot of work. That must be a microphone thing, but I sound a lot more masculine.
You do, you sound generous.
I'm keeping
wise. You sound wise.
I'm keeping this one. Now, Graham, you are a lecturer at Ridley College.
I am.
How long have you been there?
I've been at Ridley for 2.5 years.
Okay, 2.5 years. And it looks like you may have had a working career that extends beyond 2.5 years.
Because I look old. No, I work for the Anglican Church, so I have just turned 50. But as an Anglican, I'm still one of the young fellas, which is great. So it's excellent for your self-esteem. But before working for Ridley College, I was living in Sydney, and I was the principal of a place called YouthWorks College. So it was a It was originally somewhere. What was the background?
It was a word.
So a training college for people involved in children's and youth ministry, and I was there for 13.5 years.
Yeah, great. So for those of you who don't know, Graham Stanton is actually Dr. Graham Stanton and
Reverend Doctor.
Reverend Doctor, but there was no word for that actually. So tell us what we think of that. And Graham is, over the course of his ministry, I think it would be fair to say, and he would never say this, I think Graham is one of, if not one of the leading academics across our nation with regards to youth ministry. And you can see him grimacing because he's a humble guy. And he's also has been for many years a practitioner, so obviously a part of Principle of YouthWorks. And how do you find the coming together of academia and practice, and has that been, what have you learned in the transition from one to the other?
That's a really good question.
Thank you.
What have I learned? I think it took me a long time to really get into academia. When I first started at YouthWorks College, it was all about training. Training people who would be working with children and young people in local churches. So it was a bit more like TAFE than university. So it still had that practitioner element to it. Because, find most youth workers and scratch them a little bit, and you find a pragmatist underneath. They're people that actually, they want to make things happen. And young people have got that sort of urgency in the world. And so I think I had sort of captured a bit of that bug. So I really enjoyed the opportunity of seeing leaders develop and seeing ministries enabled as leaders developed. And so I think that has still been my great love. It took me a long time to really then launch into the academic space and do higher research, eventually do a PhD. And that was really in recognising that the academic scene isn't the place where everything happens. It's not the most important thing that's happening in the life of the church, but it does have a role to play. And so my title is Lecturer in Practical Theology, which makes some people think that that's either a tautology or an oxymoron. Yeah, so you know those words. So a tautology is like, we're going to meet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, same p.m. and afternoon, same thing. So practical theology, theology really ought to be practical. If it's any good, your theology should shape the way that you live, and that's right. Some people think that practical theology is an oxymoron, saying two things that don't fit together, like Queensland culture. A warm day in Launceston. But that's not the case either. Really, what practical theology is about is thinking about the things that we do as Christians, things that we do as humans, really, and thinking about what meaning is embedded in those. What do our actions mean? I could talk more about that. I see some people's eyes are glazing over already.
Yeah, I kind of regret the question. I didn't realise when you said it was a good question that meant you were going to talk.
That means that I could just talk about hours and hours.
Right, well, I'll just ask a couple more questions. Yeah. We do want you to talk about something that is very close to your heart. But before we do that, you are a parent as well. I have 3 teenage children. Yes, from university and high school. Mm-hmm. So at what point, as a parent of teenagers, did you realise you didn't know anything about youth ministry?
Fairly early on. Fortunately for me, I think that there is a different role of the youth minister in the church to the parent. What I tell youth ministers to do, I don't do at home. I think I've been able to theologise my way out of that and say that actually parents have got a particular role. They can still, well, I was using action to look like I'm hitting my children. I only do that metaphorically or lightly. Don't leave bruises. That's
Right. And last question, just we should. Last question. Just thinking. Obviously, this is off the top of my head, which is dangerous. But just thinking about it. So, where do you currently worship?
I currently worship at St Jude's in Parkville.
Right. So that would be where I was previously the minister. Would that be right?
That was a great church.
Yeah, it was. I knew you used the past tense there, but I just wanted to make the obvious point then that it would be fair to say that I've taught you everything you know. Right, well, let's Graham. Well, we're looking forward to your talk and whatever that you get into it. Thanks, buddy.
It is great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. And yeah, as a member of St Jude's in Parkville, 12 months on, while we're still waiting for somebody to come and fill shoes, it's really lovely to be with you guys at St John's, and I'm glad that you're appreciating what we are missing. But it's lovely to come talk about this topic, the Christian imagination. It is something that's close to my heart and a topic that I've been wrestling with for a while. But this is the first time I've given this talk that I've used this image, which is a wonderful image. Somebody chose it for the advertising for this, and it's so obvious, isn't it? This is the memorial to John Lennon in Central Park in New York City. So Strawberry Fields, a section of Central Park, it's opposite the apartment block where John Lennon and Yoko Ono lived, the apartment block outside which he was shot and murdered back in 1980. And it's become a bit of a shrine for Beatles fans and John Lennon fans. And obviously it's this central word comes from what is understood as one of the most played songs of the 20th century, the most requested songs of the 20th century, Imagine. And it has this really challenging line in it, doesn't it? Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. And the implication of that is if we could only do that, it's an invitation to the world. What if we were to actually work hard and imagine a world that did not have ideas like heaven and hell? Then people would start living for today rather than the future. And wouldn't that be good? Wouldn't it be great if people stopped thinking that they have this future that they're preparing for and instead just concentrated on the challenges of today? Imagine what it would be like. Imagine if we could get rid of ideas like countries, like religion, and then we would have nothing left to kill or die for. If we could imagine that sort of world and actually live in that sort of world, then we could all live in peace. What a great offer. So it makes the idea of the Christian imagination a challenging idea, doesn't it? Because we know that it doesn't matter what you imagine to be true. Stephen drove me up from Hobart this morning, and well, imagine if he had driven, imagining a world that had no speed limits and no highway patrol. I know James tries to live in that world at various times. But it's a strategy that's not going to pay off, is it? I have the ignominy of perhaps being the only principal of a theological college in Australia that had to get lifts from his students for 3 months because the government wouldn't let me drive my car anymore because I had imagined a world that I accidentally speed. I don't do it on purpose. It was just accidental. I did say to a student once, I'm going to go carbon neutral for 3 months. I'm not going to drive a car. And she said, I bet you can't do that. I bet you can't keep that up. I said, I can. You can imagine whatever you like about the world, but it's not going to change what the world is actually like. We can't just live according to our imagination, and neither can we worship Jesus simply how we choose to imagine. I'm going to show you a video clip that, in hindsight, perhaps in a moment you'll say, yeah, shouldn't have shown that one. But it comes with a warning. Okay? This comes from a satirical film. Okay? We're going to see a clip where we're going to hear from a man who is sexist, he is ageist, he is consumerist, he uses slightly inappropriate language. But I'll tell you what, he makes a sharp point about Christians. This comes from a film called Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby.
Supper's ready! Come on, y'all! Been slaving over this for hours!
Dear Lord, baby Jesus, or as our brothers to the south call you, Jesus, we thank you so much for this bountiful harvest of Domino's, KFC, and the always delicious Taco Bell. I just want to take time to say thank you for my family, my two beautiful, handsome, striking sons, Walker and Texas Ranger, or T.I., we call him. And of course my red-hot smoking wife, Carly, who's a stone-cold fox, who if you were to rate her ass on 100, it would easily be a 94. Also want to thank you for my best friend and teammate, Cal Mountain Jr., who's got my back no matter what.
Show you, baby.
Dear Lord, baby Jesus, we also thank you for my wife's father, Chip. We hope that you can use your baby Jesus powers to heal him and this horrible leg. It smells terrible, and the dogs are always bothering with it. Dear tiny infant Jesus.
Hey, sweetie, Jesus did grow up. You don't always have to call him baby. It's a bit odd not putting a cradle baby.
Look, I like the Christmas Jesus best, and I'm saying grace. When you say grace, you can say grown-up Jesus, or teenage Jesus, or bearded Jesus, or whoever you want.
You know what I want? I want you to do this grace good, so that God will let us win tomorrow.
Dear tiny Jesus, your golden fleece diapers with your tiny little fat balled-up fist
I
palms.
was a man. He had a beard.
Look, I like the baby version the best. Do you hear me? I win the races and I get the money.
Ricky, finish the damn grace.
I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo t-shirt because it says like, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. Because I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party.
I like to picture Jesus as a ninja fighting off evil samurai.
I like to think of Jesus like with giant eagle's wings and singing lead vocals for Leonard Skinner with like an angel band. And I'm in the front row and I'm hammered drunk.
Hey, Cal, why don't you shut up?
Yes, ma'am.
Here, 8 pound, 6 ounce, newborn infant Jesus. Don't even know a word yet. Just little infant, so cuddly, but still omnipotent. We just thank you for all the races I've won and $21.2 million. Woo! Woo! Woo!
Ow!
Love that money that I've accrued over this past season. Also due to a binding endorsement contract that stipulates I mention Powerade at each grace. I just want to say that Powerade is delicious and it cools you off on a hot summer day. We look forward to Powerade's release of Mystic Mountain Blueberry. Thank you for all your power and your grace, dear baby God. Amen.
Hey.
See, like all satire, all good satire, it's sort of funny, but then when you think about it for a moment, you feel the stab. Like, no wonder non-Christian people write off Christians for having this belief in an imaginary friend in the sky. I like Christmas Jesus best. Which sort of Jesus do you like best? And there is a sense you look around the church and it's like, well, the Anglicans, they like the orderly wearing a suit Jesus. And the charismatics, they like the tuxedo t-shirt Jesus. You know, we know what the human imagination is like and what the human imagination can generate. And in one sense, you look around the church, around the world, and you see a lot of the problems going on in churches because Christians are beginning to imagine how they might structure Christianity, how they might structure the Christian life, because they imagine that things might be nicer this way. And of course, if we just stuck with the King James Version, good enough for Jesus, good enough for me, then we would have known this, wouldn't we? Okay? Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, the first reference to imagination in the King James Version God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And you read through the King James, and it uses the word imagination a number of times, and it's almost always negative. There's 2 or 3 times when it's sort of neutral, could go either way, but most of the uses, it's either the evil imagination or that human beings imagined what was evil, what was contrary to the will of God. And so it seems that at the very outset, imagination and Christian faith are opposed to each other. Because you have on one side that biblical, faithful Christianity, about faithfulness, about the rules, about the truth. It's calling people to obedience. Whereas imagination is all about creativity and freedom and personal choice and exploration. And yet therein, of course, is our missional challenge, isn't it? Because when you think about the world that we live in, the culture of the early 21st century, then it's creativity and freedom and personal choice and exploration that our whole world is clamouring after. Here's a statement. By the way, the font is small. I'm sorry about that. I was going to say there are plenty of seats up the front, but there actually aren't. But I'm happy to make these slides available if you want to follow up on these things later on. But a guy called Charles Taylor, who has written about this new culture that he calls expressive individualism. He says, a way of understanding this culture is to say that each one of us has his or her own way of realising our humanity, and that it's important to find and live out one's own sense of who I am, instead of surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us from outside. Don't surrender to conformity, to a model from outside, imposed on us either from society, or from the previous generation, or from religious authority, or from political authority. That the culture that we live in is everybody's got to be free to choose their authentic self. And once I've chosen my authentic self, then I need to be free to express that. What's the number one mantra that our children are learning at school? Just be true to yourself. If you're going to win MasterChef, just make sure you cook from the heart. Well, I don't know what the heck that means. But put yourself on the plate. Okay? It's become this sort of language. It's all around us. We don't sort of notice. It's sort of like the ubiquitous, hi, how are you? I'm not really interested. But I'm saying it because that's how we greet one another. This be true to yourself. It's everywhere. And in contrast, the church, well, it seems kind of lame. It's all about faithfulness, rules, truth, and obedience. David Tacey is a Christian who lectures in spirituality at, it's either La Trobe or Monash University in Melbourne, in one of the secular universities in Melbourne. And as he gets students that come to do his courses in spirituality, these are not Christian people who come, but they're Australian young people who are interested enough in things of the Spirit to do a course at university on it. And this is sort of an expression of one of their points of view that Tacey has sort of pieced together from his experience of teaching these students. They say that conventional forms of Christianity seem not to be interested in personal risk or adventure, because the great truths have already been revealed, and it's simply a matter of devoting oneself to what is already known. At one level I read that and I think, we've thought about this, we've got some really great answers, and here's something which is known that if you devote yourself to this, then here's the path to life. But of course, in our culture today, that just says that there's nothing of interest here. And then I think about often the ways that we've tried to present this grand Christian story to our world. And said, we can summarise this into 6 dot points. Here is this text that written over centuries and all these different perspectives and stories and texts, and we can summarise it. We've even got diagrams to go with it. It's really easy. And now we've got a whole generation of people that have been turned off by that. A guy called David Kinnaman did some work in the US, and he interviewed a whole lot of young adults who used to be part of the church. The statistics in Australia are horrifying. That of the 11-year-olds that are currently involved in church, that by the time they reach 18 to 24, 72% of them will no longer attend church regularly. Now this is true across the Western world. The problem in Australia is that we have far fewer 11-year-olds involved in church than in the US or in the UK. And we have a far greater drop-off by the time they reach young adulthood than in the US and the UK. Kinnaman interviewed those, well, in the US, about 50% of people previously involved in church, now no longer, and he identified a number of reasons. What were the things that they pointed to? And one of the things that they said was, the church is a creativity killer, where risk-taking and being involved in culture are anathema. They're cursed. That if you are a risk-taker, if you are culturally engaged, then you need to really get out of our fellowship because we're not interested in that sort of thing. And Kinnaman asks the question of us, how can the church peel back the tamper-resistant safety seal? You know those medicine bottles that we don't want children to be able to get into? It's these questions of creativity. They're saying the church has just locked it up and saying don't go there. How can we peel back the tamper-resistant safety seal, making space for imaginative risk-taking and creative self-expression, traits that are so valued within the next generation? Now, I think the critique of the church in America doesn't universally apply to the church in Australia. That I don't think we are as much creativity killers as perhaps some of the churches that Kinnaman is engaged with. But I think the critique still holds to a certain extent, doesn't it? That when you ask people in our culture, in our society, who are the most creative groups in our culture? Not many people say, oh, the Christians. They're really creative. They're really innovative. They're really edgy, those people. That's not what we're known for. Now the question is, should we be known for that? Because we don't want to just do, the culture wants us to stand on one leg and sing. So we're going to stand on one leg and sing. We can do this. Whatever you want, we can be like exactly what you want. But that's not what we're called to do. So we want to ask, what does the scriptures say about imagination? One more video clip. This one's much more fun. This challenge between the imagination and Christian faith, it's really a lot like the Lego movie.
Good morning, apartment. Good morning, doorway. Good morning, wall. Morning, ceiling. Good morning, floor. Ready to start the day. Here it is. Instructions to fit in and have everybody like you and always be happy. Step 1, breathe. Okay, got that one down. Step 2, greet the day, smile, and say, good morning, say. I have no idea what's going on or what this place is at all.
I am Princess Unikitty, and I welcome you all to Cloud Cuckoo Land.
There's no signs or anything. How does anyone know what not to do?
Here in Cloud Cuckoo Land, there are no rules. There's no government, no babysitters, no bedtimes, no crabby faces, no bushy mustaches, and no negativity of any kind.
You just said the word no like 1,000 times.
And there's also no consistency.
I hate this place.
Any idea is a good idea.
The Bible gives us God's instructions. How to be a good Christian, how to be a good human being. You need to follow the instructions like Emmett, and then everything will be awesome. Alternatively, use your imagination. Make up whatever you want to, like Princess Unikitty, where any idea is a good idea. And I think a lot of Australians would see that the church is a bit like this cookie cutter world like Emmett and would desire to live in cloud cuckoo land. And I think a lot of Christians would find cloud cuckoo land like Batman. I hate this place. How can we bring these things together? Well, if you've seen the Lego movie, then you will know that Emmett finds a way of bringing these things together. And so I'm going to cast myself in his role. I'm not quite the chosen one like he is, but neither is he. How can we bring these two supposedly opposed worlds together? And here's my big statement. Biblical faithfulness requires us to use our imagination. I'm not just trying to argue that to be a biblically faithful Christian creates space for the imagination. That you can still be a good Christian and still allow a little bit of imaginative creativity every now and then. Okay? I don't want to argue that. Instead, what I want to argue is that if we actually want to be faithful to God, if we want to be faithful to the God who has revealed himself to us in the Lord Jesus Christ, housed in the Scriptures, as we come to understand this God through this text, then that will demand of us the use of our imaginations. The imagination which has been given to us by a Creator God. And I want to do that in three ways. I want us to think about metaphor, I want us to think about story, and I want us to think about drama. And we'll cover that over these next two sessions. So let's start by thinking about metaphor. You know, the thing about metaphor is that the word metaphor is a metaphor. It comes from a Greek word that means to carry over. And that's what a metaphor does. Now, I know if you're an English teacher here, I'm married to an English teacher, so I love English teachers. But the distinction between metaphor and simile, like I'm not going to go there. All I'm saying, figurative language. Okay? What figurative language is doing is takes the meaning of one thing and carries it over and applies it to another thing. Yeah? You still with me? Okay. I haven't aroused all sorts of negative ideas from associating English. It's not, people aren't reliving their days at school. Just take a deep breath, that's okay, you're not there. We have something that is known, and we take the meaning that we know about that and we carry it over and we apply to something which is unknown. So we can understand more of the unknown by making these connections. Okay? That's what a metaphor does, that's what figurative language does. Now, I need you to do a bit of work and tell me, what are some metaphors for God that the Bible uses? What are some metaphors for God? Just shout them out.
Father.
God is Father. Holy. God is holy, and that's not so much a metaphor, it's a description of God being set apart. Okay? So he is different to us. But are there metaphors that talk about his holiness? It talks about God is like one who rides on the clouds. So there's a metaphor that speaks to us of holiness.
Shepherd.
Yeah, it's like a shepherd.
Like a vine.
Like a vine, yeah.
King of Kings.
Yeah, a king, yeah.
Lion.
What's that?
Lion.
A lion, absolutely, yeah.
Judge.
A judge,
Yeah. And their chicks.
a hen and her chicks, yeah. Jesus speaks about wanting to gather Jerusalem under his wings. Okay.
He's also a creator.
Yeah, a creator, a craftsperson. There's an article, there's a dictionary called the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery, and if you go there and find the article on God, these are the metaphors that they list there. God is a father, a redeemer. God is one who is pregnant and gives birth. Isaiah 42 verse 14, God says, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out, I pant. It's startling. God is a midwife. Psalm 22 verses 9 to 10. You brought me out of my mother's womb. You cast me on my mother's belly at birth. God is a midwife. He is a nurse. He is a homemaker. Here's a man speaking to his friend. God is like a drunken soldier. Psalm 78, verse 65. It says, as a man wakes from a drunken stupor, so I will now rise and act. God is like a king, a lawgiver, a judge, an advocate, a warrior, a mighty one, a besieging enemy, one who rides on the clouds. God is a maker, a shepherd, a potter, a builder, a farmer, a wine grower, an orchardist, a metal worker, a tent maker, a knitter. All you knitters out there. I'm always envious of the way that women get to knit at meetings. Why can't I bring my hobby to a meeting? The answer is because I would not pay attention to the meeting, because I can only do one thing at a time. Yeah. But God is a knitter. Psalm 139. You knit me together in my mother's womb. God is a weaver, a clothes maker, a gardener, a house cleaner. Isaiah 14, verse 23. God says, I will sweep Israel with the broom of destruction. God is a teacher. God is wisdom. God is a composer. God is a singer. Zephaniah 3, verse 17. God will sing over you with a soft lullaby. God is a healer. God is a helper. God is a comforter. He is a saviour. God is light, fire, a rock, a banner, a lion, a leopard, an eagle, a she-bear, and a mother hen. It's extraordinary. The range of metaphor that is applied to God. It's confronting. This is what one author says. That is way too small to read. I don't know what the person putting these slides together was thinking. They would be able to read that. But this comes from a guy called Christopher Wright, as he speaks about the way that the biblical writers use metaphor. He says, although the Israelites repudiated actual physical images of Yahweh, he's obviously an academic, Israelites did not make images. And you know that because of the second commandment. Okay? Do not make a graven image of God. Things above or things beneath. Okay? Because God is spirit. We control God. We limit God when we make a graven image of Him. But even though that was true of Israel, it says they were not lacking in creativity when it came to rhetorical imagery for Yahweh. That is this metaphorical language that we've looked at. This imagery is drawn vigorously from the created and human order. Israel's language imagery for Yahweh made him very visible to the mental eye. So we don't see him physically, but we are given images to our mental eye. Okay? Our mental eye is just a code word for imagination. This is rich image of God in our imaginations through a rich and often daring anthropomorphic and metaphorical style. Anthropomorphic is making God like a human. When it says that God is angry, literally in Hebrew it says God's nose was hot. You know when you get really angry and your nose goes red? That's how the Israelites pictured God. Now they're not saying that God has a nose because God is not human. God is not physical like us. God is spirit. And yet, they were able to have this daring anthropomorphic style. Now, here is the key. This bottom line says, the affirmation that Yahweh is personal seemed more urgent than fear about his invisible spirituality. See, that's what's going on. They want to affirm that God is personal. There are lots of metaphors from impersonal things like fire and light and rock, and that all helps us to understand, take the known and apply it to the unknown. But what this guy's particularly pointing out is these likenesses, likening God to a pregnant woman, a woman in labour, likening God to a man who is drunk stunning as pointing out that if we want to know God, then we've got to understand God in personal terms. The Bible is so full of metaphor that it's saying if you want to engage with this God who has been revealed in this word, then you must use your imagination. Now why? Why would God do that? Well, Augustine asked this question. Augustine commented on the imagery in the Bible, and he said, because ideas that you've got to work hard to get are ideas that are more valuable in the end. I think there's something to that. God reveals himself to us in a way that means we've got to think, we've got to work hard to understand what's going on here. It's like Jesus' parables. Jesus speaks in parables so that those who are on the outside are going to just hear that and think, well, that's just a silly story and not pay any more attention. But those on the inside, they'll keep thinking and exploring, and Jesus sort of draws us in. The metaphors do that as well. What we also know about metaphor today is from brain scans that show us that when you encounter a metaphor like your word is as sweet as honey. Right now, as you're thinking about the metaphor that the Bible, reading the words of God, is like the sweetness of honey to our soul, the parts of your brain that light up when you eat honey are now lighting up as well. Because our brains work so that these sensory motor parts of our brain are activated when we engage with metaphor. There's something about our whole person, our whole created being that's going on here. And it's also just more fun. Because what do we do with a metaphor? Well, we ruminate on them. You ruminate on a metaphor, and cows are probably the most famous ruminants. There are lots of animals that are ruminants. I actually did a little bit of research and realised I'm so thankful that I'm not a cow. Because this is what they do. They chew the cud. That's what a ruminant is. They eat grass, but they can't break it down. If they just eat grass and swallow it, then they're not going to be able to digest it properly. So they've got to eat it, and then they swallow it into the first part of their stomach. And in the first part of their stomach, this sort of softens up a bit. And then, the really good thing about being a cow is that they then vomit that back up into their mouth, and they get to chew it a second time. And that's what cows spend most of their life doing. And then they are able to digest it into the other part of their stomach so that they can digest it properly. Now, one of those parts of the stomach has got something to do with ruminant language. I'm not sure which, but I'm a practical theologian, not a biologist. But see, the thing is this, that when we engage with metaphor, we ruminate. We're able to ruminate on them. Let's take a metaphor. Psalm 18, verse 2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer. Now, the Lord is my rock, my fortress. Here is a metaphor. It's not a literal statement. We don't worship a rock. We don't worship a fort. It's a metaphor. It's helping us to understand something about God. So what we need to do is to first let the image soften in the first part of your mind. What do we know about rocks? We know rocks to be strong. We know rocks to provide a place of security. A fortress is made of rock, of stone. And a fortress is a place so that when you are under attack and you need a place of safety, well, then you either climb up onto or behind a big rock or into a stone fortress. You enter into a fortress so that you might be kept safe when the enemy is approaching. So what's Psalm 18 verse 2 saying? As we've allowed the image to sort of soften in our mind, we're able to say Psalm 18 verse 2 is telling us that God keeps his people safe from harm. Now I find myself again going back to poetry class in English, year 11, St Ives High, and think, well, why didn't the poet just say that? Why can't we just say God keeps us safe from harm? And often I think as Christians we're a bit like that. We read the Psalms and think, goodness, it's all a bit of hard work. All this guff, you could have just made it a lot easier if you just said the Lord keeps us safe from harm. The Bible could have been like a tenth the length that it is. If you just took away all these extra words and just told us exactly what you wanted to say. But that's not what you do with metaphors. You do need to let the metaphor soften. You need to conceptualize the metaphor. Okay? That's what I'm talking about here. But then we need to allow that concept to then be vomited back up into our mind and ruminate on it, to chew on it. And take this idea that the God who keeps his people safe from harm is like a rock. I would imagine, I bring to my mind's eye a rock that I can hide behind. That I can picture myself in a battle. And the enemy is coming and I'm terrified, but I make it to the fortress in time. And that I can be in the fortress, I can imagine myself in the fortress, hearing the battle rage outside, but knowing that I'm safe. And I can connect all of that with my relationship with the God who has promised to be my God in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. We need to conceptualize a metaphor. So we need to understand what is actually being communicated here. And be careful, a metaphor is not giving us license to say anything. So you can't say, oh, the Lord is a rock. He's like a piece of gravel in your shoe. You know when you walk along your piece of gravel, God is irritating. That's what I take from this psalm. God is really irritating. And a fortress, it's a place where I'm kept in a fortress. I don't have any freedom. I'm captured. And so that's what God is like. Okay, Psalm 82, I read Psalm 82 to say God is irritating and God takes away your freedom. That's why I don't want to be a Christian. No, you can't really say that. It's not what the Psalm's saying. Okay? The language doesn't work like that. So metaphors are not this open-ended, use your imagination to say whatever you like. When Jesus says he's coming like a thief in the night, doesn't mean he's going to come and deprive you of your safety and nick your television. The metaphors themselves are constrained by the text. That there's things that Psalm 18 is saying that we've got to conceptualize properly. But this conceptualization, coming to this idea that Psalm 18 verse 2 in this metaphor is talking about God as a place of safety, safety from harm, a God who brings protection. The authority in this statement still lies with the biblical text. These words, the Lord is my rock, my fortress. That's what we need to keep returning to. So there is in a sense that we go from the biblical text and we understand concepts of what's being communicated by this, but we're driven back to the text, back to the imagery, so that we might dwell in the imagery. Let the image ruminate, chew on it in our mind. And so that's what you are going to do. Here's the part of the afternoon where you do a bit of work. What I want you to do is to choose one of these passages, one of these metaphors. Psalm 42 verse 1. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul longs for you, O Lord. Matthew 22 verse 37, we spoke about it before. Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I have longed to gather you under my wings. Romans 12 verse 1. In view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Okay. 3 metaphors. I want you to choose one. And with the people around you, I want you to conceptualize and then ruminate. just for a little bit. The good thing about ruminating is you can do it forever. You're going to be able to ruminate on these metaphors all the rest of this week, but we're just going to start today. Okay? So I want you to do the work of conceptualising. What does the metaphor mean? And then ruminate on it a bit. Imagine. Use your imagination. What is this metaphor communicating? What is it offering to us? What is there as we engage with our mind's eye with what we're offered here in Scripture? Okay? Does that make sense? All right? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to do this. I'm not sure whether that's 2 minutes or not. I'm sure it's not that. Who looked at Psalm 42? Psalm 42. Try and give us some conceptualisation. What's the message here? As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. Yeah.
You're looking for coolness and calm,
Yeah.
away from the heat of battle.
Okay. Yeah. Coolness and calm away from the heat of battle. Lovely. Any other conceptualisation statements? Yeah.
You're aware of your need. We really are
Yes.
thirsty.
Yeah. Yeah. So
You want
I.
something to satisfy.
Yes. I'm in need, and I'm looking to God to satisfy me with coolness and calmness. Yeah.
And here is probably wandering aimlessly looking for a source of life-giving water. And once he found it, he would stay there until he was filled.
Yeah, so there's a sense of looking around, not finding the coolness, the refreshment from God. So I have this need, and there are not many other places, or there are no other places that are going to satisfy that need. Yeah. Okay. Either.
My desire to know more about him.
Yeah. This desire for more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've conceptualised, we've got a sense of that's what this is about. Okay? The psalmist is saying that he recognises his need for God, and that the need is not able to be satisfied by others, but is satisfied in God. Yeah. But any statements around the ruminating? What does the metaphor actually give for us? In one sense, we've begun that already, because this idea of coolness and calmness, and even the words are sort of cool and calm, it quietens me down as I think of this. Any other comments around the ruminating?
Well, just the contemporary image that you could add to it. I'd like us to speak of the story about cows rushing for a water tanker.
Yeah.
In northern New South Wales.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit more, relevant.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Which is the thirst of human dehydration. I've experienced where the back of the tongue starts to swell up, and you start not being able to physically swallow anymore. And you can't just go and drink water because you'll vomit it up. So you need healing desperately because you're in an extreme situation. And so that's extending that metaphor beyond what it says.
Yeah, and so here is another thing of what the imagination creativity does. Okay, is that we get to extend this because it draws our thinking out. Okay? And so the contemporizing of a metaphor. So as the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul longs for you. As those cows rush to the water that's provided in drought, that's what's been communicated to us here. And so that sort of is that connection that we draw. Then you've got this idea of and then when you think about human thirst, it's like if we do just drink too quickly, then we'll vomit. So, hang on, what does that mean? Does that mean that we've got to be careful? Don't read too much of the Bible, because if you read too much, then you're going to vomit. That's not going to be good for you. And so it's that acknowledging still that our imagination is engaged, but the authority still lies with the text. So we keep coming back to read what's going on here and how much does that direct our thinking. A guy called Walter Brueggemann, who writes a lot about the imagination, speaks of the disciplined imagination. Sounds again like an oxymoron, doesn't it? But so much creativity is disciplined. You think about poets that write sonnets. A sonnet is a disciplined imagination because there's a certain number of syllables or beats that you need in a certain number of lines that at one point I knew, but I kissed English goodbye, didn't I? So there's discipline in the way that we use our imagination, and we are being disciplined by the text. Okay, let's go to Matthew 23. We look at Matthew 23. Give us a conceptualization statement.
You use in English.
Anybody else able to just conceptualize what is the text saying?
I have tried to help you, but you keep on rejecting it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like today's society, certain people stand up for Christianity and get howled down by the media and everybody else because we're not in what's supposed to be current thinking mode.
Okay, right. So we've again gone beyond and began to apply and think through what does this mean. Let's go back to what is Jesus saying? He wants to protect them. Yeah. He wants to help them. He wants to keep them safe because of their infancy. There is an incapability in them that needs to be made up by Jesus' protection. And that's the idea of the mother hen. So it's because it's a different image to the fortress. So Jesus could have said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to be your rock and fortress.
But Jerusalem already was a rock and a fortress.
All sorts of reasons why he didn't choose that. And at least one is to say that he wanted to communicate something different. And communicating something different is in this idea of a mother hen caring for its chicks. Different than saying, I wanted to be for you a strong king that would protect you. It's got the same note of protection. But of course it's different, isn't it? Because the metaphor evokes something different in our minds. Anybody got comments on the rumination on that metaphor? What the extra richness that is communicated?
Jesus remembered the story of an American farmer his crop was wiped out by a fire. And as he was walking across the field, he saw this hen burned to death, and in his anger he kicked it. And as he kicked it, the little chicks ran from under him.
Yes. Yeah. Huh. I wonder whether that's a regular thing for hens. To sacrifice themselves to save others. Is that true? I mean, that again is where the metaphorical richness of this drives us back into that culture. You think about a lot of the images of the bridegroom and the bride. So there's been a lot of work that people have done who know the culture of the Middle East, that know the traditions around weddings, and we can make a mistake when we take an image and idea that we think we're familiar with. This idea of weddings. Oh yeah, I've been to weddings. Oh yeah, Jesus is like the bridegroom. Or the attendant, and John the Baptist like the attendant, the best man. So John the Baptist is the guy who's going to stand up on the last day and tell a funny story about Jesus and how Jesus got hammered drunk once and how funny it was, and everybody else is going to think that's not funny at all because that's what best men do. But actually, no, in the first century there's a very different dynamic that's going on, so we need to enter into that. One of the classics is the idea of friendship. When God says he calls Abraham his friend. Interestingly, the Bible Abraham never says God is my friend. Jesus says, I now call you friends. But the disciples never called Jesus their friend. You think, how does that work? If I'm your friend, then you're my friend, because that's how friendship works in our culture. Friendship is equal, it's shared. But that's not how they use the language of friendship in the ancient world. In the ancient world, friendship could be this one way. It was a relationship of privilege that was extended from another. And there's a danger when we say, yeah, God is my friend. Hang on, what does that mean? Because often friendship means, they're the person that I don't call for ages, but they know that I'm still friends. They're the ones that the person I can mock in public, but that's right, they know because we're friends. No, there's still that sense of authority and submission. Going off point. Romans 12, in our final comments here about we are living sacrifices. What's been communicated here? What's the concept? Did anybody look at this one? Some do, but they're not going to own up now because I know I ask difficult questions.
We had a dash.
Yeah, you had a dash?
We actually ended that conversation talking about baptism, dying to what we were and rising to new life.
Yeah, another metaphor, by the way.
Yes, exactly. And this living sacrifice, what does it mean to sacrifice? And you have to be living.
Yes, yeah.
So, Paul himself who wrote these words was very familiar with sacrifices.
Yeah. So the concept of sacrifice is?
The church the church exists for others because you have the plural and the singular.
Absolutely, yes. Present your bodies, plural, as one living sacrifice. So there is something very unifying about this community. Yeah. But that idea of a sacrifice is wholly given over. So present your bodies, be in your physical life, everything it means for you to be a human being, as a community, together, give yourselves fully to God and His purposes. Sacrifice to lose your life. Give up your life for the sake of the mercies of God, in light of the mercies of God. It's a powerful image. And then think about, then we allow that to rotate. That's what being a Christian is. Okay? How could we ever think of being Christian meaning coming to an event once a week, perhaps twice if we're keen? That's not a sacrifice. I think it was John Stott who said the problem with living sacrifices is that they keep crawling off the altar. Okay, let me move on. So remember my big point. What I'm trying to say is that the imagination is called out of us because of the nature of God's revelation of Himself. The richness of metaphor in the Bible requires the use of the imagination. It doesn't mean that imagination is a make up whatever you want, choose your own adventure. What do you think God is like? I think God is like a fairy force. I think God is like a traffic policeman. You can't do whatever you like. That's not the invitation. The invitation is to an imagination that is disciplined by the text. We need to conceptualize the metaphors. We can't just make them mean whatever we want them to mean. But the metaphors are given to us that they might live in our minds. Then you think, what does it mean to have a quiet time? You use that language. The devotional life. You have a quiet time every day. Okay? You've got to read your Bible and pray. And sometimes that can be like one of those things that you've got to tick off. I do that. I read my Bible and pray for half an hour every morning, and then I get on with my day and be as crabby and cranky and angry and self-centered as I want to be. So I've done the Christian thing. I'm going to go to church on Sunday, perhaps, if there's not better on. Yeah. But no, we're called to meditate on God's word constantly. Well, you can, because you have these metaphors that can ruminate in your mind. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You've been sitting on the bus and you just play with that idea. Does it mean to be a living sacrifice? That is a meditation on God's word that is constantly giving. And that's what metaphors enable us to do. But not just metaphors. Let's talk about story. 75% of the Bible is story. About 15% is poetry, and about 10% is instruction. That's odd. Like if you wanted to be an authority, you imagine a military commander coming into to a group of soldiers and briefing them for the day. You would expect the general to come in and say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this, 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 and this. You guys are going to do that. You guys are going to do this. This is our objective. This is what we're going to do. Clear instructions. It would be really odd if the commander came in and said, hey, let me tell you a story. You know, once upon a time, but what if the general came in and said, let me tell you a story. The people that we're going in to protect today are people that have lived in this part of the world for generations. And there are others that have come in and have infiltrated, and there are people that are looking to take away their freedom and their culture. We come from a society that values freedom. The people that first established this military force in our country did it because they realised that the strength that we have is the strength that should be used in the service of others. And that's who we are. And we're going in today to fulfil this mission. And there is a story, and that story is powerful. And that story is one that is directed not just to our head, but to our heart. And I think that the authority of the Bible works in a very similar way. And what our imagination enables us to do is to enter into these stories. Not just to ask the question, was that story true or not? But to invite us to consider how these stories might be powerful. How might they be life-changing for us? Now, I'm going to pick this up more in the second session. But for now, let's just realise that the way that we engage with story is very similar to the way we engage with metaphor. Because in one sense, a story is just an extended metaphor. We conceptualise and we ruminate. But there are some different steps. Let's come to this story from Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus, the vertically challenged man that wants to see Jesus. So he climbs the tree. He climbs the sycamore tree. We were on a Bible Lands tour in Israel, and we came to Jericho, and the guide pointed out, this is a sycamore tree. And one of the people on our tour, is this the one that Zacchaeus climbed? This has been a sequence of a lot of reasonably silly questions that have been asked, and the guy said, yeah, this is it, this is the one. Everyone took photos of the tree. You see that Luke himself conceptualises the story. Because verse 10 in Luke 19 says, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Okay, we're given the answer. What is Luke 19, 1-10 about? What is the story of Zacchaeus about? Well, it's about Jesus coming to seek and to save those who are lost. Okay? We conceptualise the story. Again, you can't just imagine the story to mean anything. It's Jesus has a particular love for short people. The reason that Jesus, well, he does. The reason that God created trees was to enable short people to be able to worship Jesus. You can't just make anything up from the story. Because what the story is about is that the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. Zacchaeus was lost. Jesus sought him out. Jesus saved him. But of course, if that was all God wanted us to know, then we would have just had Luke chapter 19, verse 10. And we wouldn't have had to worry about verses 1-9. Think of all the questions that we have that God could have answered in those 9 verses. If we just economised, just told us the answer and forgot the story. But of course, the story is powerful. That we're given the story not just so that we might know what's being communicated, but so we might live in this. I want to suggest 4 steps of ruminating on a story. Well, I ask, what if you were there? What if you were him? What if he were here? And what if you were here as he would be here? Notice these questions, what they're doing is taking you in your imagination from the first century and Jericho through to the 21st century in Launceston. Okay? So let's come first to Jericho and ask, what if you were there? So imagine yourself that day, there are crowds, and people hear that Jesus is coming along. What would you be doing? Begin by thinking, how would it feel? What would you be able to hear? What would you smell? What's the feeling of being present in that day? And then think, how would I respond if I heard that Jesus was coming along? Now, put yourself in Zacchaeus' shoes. So now, rather than being a bystander to the story, now let's enter in the story and you as Zacchaeus. What would it feel like to be him? You're a chief tax collector. People hate you. But there's something in you that has made you want to see Jesus. And there is something in you that makes you want to see Jesus so much that you are going to climb a tree so that you might see him. What would it feel like to be standing beneath the tree thinking, should I climb a tree? I don't know, it's a bit embarrassing. Should I do that? No. But now you're up there. Okay? And I wonder what you would see people saying. What would you be sensing of the crowd? And then Jesus comes, and then Jesus stops. What would it be like to be Zacchaeus? Jesus has stopped at the foot of the tree that you are sitting in. Now he's not only stopped, he's talking. He's talking to you. What would it feel like for Jesus, the one that you so long to see, that you even climbed a tree, that is now standing beneath that tree and now talking to you. And now he's not only talking to you, he's calling you down and he's inviting himself to your place. And now you've made this confession that you will change your life. And what would it be like to be him? Enter into this story with your imagination. If you like, begin to ask some other questions. What would it have been like at dinner? What do you think, if you was Zacchaeus, what do you think he said to his neighbours the next day? Can you imagine going to one of the people that you ripped off with this double repayment? What do they say to you? What do you say back to them when they say, what the heck are you doing? What do you, Zacchaeus, what do you say? Enter into this story with your imagination. Okay, now ask the question, what if Zacchaeus was here? What if Zacchaeus, with all that had happened to him, that sort of faith that made him climb a tree, that sort of faith that made him respond to Jesus with this transformed life, imagine he was going to work on Monday, to your workplace. Imagine he was going to go home this afternoon to whatever challenges you face when you walk into the door. What would his attitude of faith and trust in Jesus drive him to do in the context that we find ourselves? And now can you imagine, what if you were like him? What if you were to engage with your office politics on Monday the way that Zacchaeus, in his transformed, Jesus encountered transformed life, how he would engage with that? How would you engage with the issues that are going on at home, the way that Zacchaeus who longed to see Jesus and who was changed by him, how he would have responded? You see? We've taken this imaginative journey and gone from there to now because the vehicle of the story has enabled us to do that. And we've sat with that story. Yes, we need to conceptualize the story. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. But what does it mean to be lost? And what does it mean to be sought out by Jesus? What does it mean to be saved by Jesus? And the story gives us a place to dwell with our imagination, that we might be transformed by a story that becomes powerful. Yeah?